you, Michele. So again, welcome to ITSS Verona. I will just briefly introduce Waqar, and thank you for being here on my behalf as well. It's a pleasure to introduce you. So Waqar is a Canadian journalist, and he has a very broad expertise in media as well as broadcasting. And Waqar was living and working as well in the Middle East, and particularly in Iran and the United Arab Emirates. So he's also very fluent in Persian, and he has obviously a very deep and broad understanding of regional politics. He has also hosted a number of TV programs and online programs where he was interviewing diplomats and analysts on Middle Eastern security. And at the moment, he's a consultant for a number of think tanks on political issues. Again, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Carlota, for that very, very kind introduction. Thank you, Michele, as well, for that kind introduction earlier on as well. And thank you, of course, to ITSS Verona for giving me this opportunity to be part of this wonderful event. Thank you to everybody who is joining us and who will join us later on as well, I'm sure, as this program continues. I know the title of this program, many people might think is kind of presumptuous to say we're going to be talking about the Middle East big three, but I don't think it's presumptuous to say that the likes of the Iranians, the Saudis, and the Israelis are in fact the big three players of the region. We can argue that there is so no tomorrow that every single Middle Eastern player is actually a big player, depending on how you view things. But I think that the title of this event is perfect considering the kind of impact these three countries have on each other as well, which we will certainly discuss, and on the rest of the region, and in fact the world as a whole, and all those details we will certainly go into. So I'm really glad to be here. One of the things that I want to say, as Michele there mentioned, is that I really want this to be interactive. I do not want this to be a one-sided discussion just between people watching and just observing, but I'd really like for questions to be sent in from the get-go. So as you are hearing Omri, Martina, as well as John present their respective viewpoints of their own chosen countries, internal and external security threats of those three countries, you can start sending in the questions immediately to me via the chat feature. I would prefer not to have the audio or video question answer because I'll just make it very messy with muting people. So I prefer that if you could just send me, if you want to send me a direct message, that's perfectly fine. I will be watching my chat feature throughout this event. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over directly firstly to Martina, who's going to be presenting. She will be discussing the Saudi viewpoint, of course, internal security issues as well as external. Martina, over to you.
Thank you very much. So are we going to upload the slides? Can you? And then brief introduce myself, if you read on it. Well, I'm actually a research assistant at the International Center for Counterterrorism at LIA, and I joined the ITSS and this magnificent group on February 2021. Yeah. I also had an internship at the Italian embassy in Riyadh. So I'm trying to specialize myself and to deepen my knowledge into Saudi Arabia. As Waqar said, we are going to present the external and internal issues that are related to security. So if you go on with the first slide. Okay, this is an amazing tangled knot of networks, of Middle East networks. So I won't go very deep and in details because it would take too much time. But I would just stress something that you can clearly see from this image is that there is not a major actor in the Middle East arena. But I think that what is clear for all the knowledge that we acquired on the Middle East is that when it comes to counter the possibility of an actor to emerge, an actor as Iran, many alliances and many partnerships arise. And this is actually the case of Middle East. So if you go on with the next slide. Well, so in this sense, many have defined the Iranian threat as an obsession. And such obsession concerns, first of all, Saudi Arabia and Israel and the US as well. However, I think that it concerns the US in a less radical way than the previous powers. And this is clear in Trump's reluctance to respond to destabilizing actions that occurred in September 2019 and that have been attributed to Iran. I'm talking about the attacks against Aramco's oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and against the oil tankers of the UAE. And such event had shattered the hope that the Gulf monarchs had to see a return from the US military role as a deterrent against Tehran's aggressive ambitions. However, it would be wrong to interpret the assassination of Soleimani as a genuine demonstration that the United States intend to protect its allies in the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, the Trump administration has showed that Washington can still draw red lines, but also that they only apply when there are direct American interests at stake. So this is not for Aramco, not for the safety of the strategic maritime sea, not for the large sensitive objectives in the Arabian Peninsula. This is only for American interests. And of course, the settlement of Biden has had clear influence on the attitude of Iran, whose priority is now to return to dealing with the United States, and then with the other signatories of the so-called 5+, the JCPOA. And when the US and Iran find a compromise, there would be a regional and military realignment of these actors. So this is what the other actors are fearing, because in the event of a compromise, a dominant actor such as Iran could re-emerge from an economic and a political point of view. And this is a big, scary future and possible event. Next slide, please. So, such frame can probably explain the ongoing birth of new partnerships, for which I think that the Abraham Accord is an emblematic example. This was a joint statement between the State of Israel, the UAE, and the US that has now been expanded to a series of agreements between Israel and the UAE and the Bahrain as well, in the respective Bahrain-Israel normalization agreement. But I want to make sure that it is not a question of making peace between Arabs and Israelis, also because these countries have never been at war with each other, nor has any new page opened in the Middle East, as Trump had announced, because in fact, this kind of normalization has been a reality for almost a decade. And in fact, the Arab Gulf countries, including Qatar and Oman, have been cultivating economic, financial, and most importantly, intelligence and security relations with Israel. And they did it for years. And behind the scene, there were also the presence of Saudi Arabia. Even if it must be said that Gulf monarchies have different ideas on how to deal with this kind of dossier. Next slide. So, nonetheless, there is no doubt that this obsession has generated from a solid basis. In fact, I'm talking about the war in Yemen, which is a dual front for Saudi Arabia. So, first of all, of course, the Saudi point of view while facing Yemen is that Yemen, and most importantly the Houthi rebels, are a fifth column of the Iranian army. And this makes discussion on Yemen very important, very crucial. So this is a dual front, because on the one hand, Saudi's worries are due due to the Iranian support to Houthi militias that are basically Shia rebel groups that have been able to dominate a vast territory extending from the north to the center-south of the country, and now have partial access to the Red Sea and are present along the border with Saudi Arabia. And most importantly, they have historically controlled the capital, that is Sana'a. And here comes the second internal front, because Riyadh is present in the south, where there are two forces. There are the loyalists and the separatists, and an agreement has been signed in order to make stabilization of the south in a future. But in fact, the action of Saudi Arabia in the last 5 years has proved to be a real failure, just because this kind of war cannot be won if Saudis do not come in compromise with the militias men, thus the Houthi rebels. Last slide, please. So, all things considered, external affairs have been an important part of the overall approach of Mohammed bin Salman and his determination. And just in a few words, Mohammed bin Salman is the crown prince to whom the current and elderly King Salman has formally and in fact transferred several powers. And this latter has centralized such powers at all the levels, thus gaining absolute control of instruments such as the armed force, intelligence, the police, the National Guard. So in some way, MBS colloquially has shown to be an able pilot for the political transition. But I must tell to you that these took high cost, because dissident members of the family and most importantly the former government entourage were ousted, were eliminated, robbed, and held hostage, and then forced to accept the new course. And I hope that I will have time to further stress this last point, because the internal balance of the royal family has clear repercussions on the external affairs. But now I'm leaving the floor to Omri. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Martina. That was wonderful. I think the mention at the end of the royal family was really, really important, and we'll certainly discuss those dynamics during the discussion. Omri, over to you.
Thank you very much, Waqar. Hello, everyone. If you allow me just to say a word or two about myself, I'm a researcher, analyst, and historian of Middle Eastern and terrorism issues. I have a master's degree from King's College London in terrorism and security issues. I have professional experience as an intelligence analyst in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, on-ground operations manager, and a financial fraud analyst. I manage and write a blog on Middle Eastern geopolitics called Oriented, a Guide to the Middle East. So as the only Israeli in the ITSS at the moment, I will discuss Israel's external and internal security challenges. The bottom line of my argument is that the threats Israel face, both in the geopolitical arena as well as in the domestic one, are tied to wider regional trends. In other words, even though Israel is different in many ways to other Middle countries, with the most obvious difference being that it is not an Arab country, to better understand Israel's threats, one ought to understand the wider state of affairs, from regional alliances and rivalries to the Arab Spring. From a bird's eye perspective on the region, we can safely say that the Middle East is in a revolutionary state and is experiencing a historical crisis. It goes beyond proxy wars throughout the region and the early Arab Spring upheavals in North Africa. Even countries that did not experience a direct and violent revolution are deeply shaken to their core, really, by the inertia and velocity of the regional state of affairs. And Israel is no different. Geopolitically, what lies behind Israel's obvious challenges, such as the threat from Lebanon to its north in the form of war with Hezbollah, or the constant Iranian subversion efforts and support of anti-Israeli forces across the region, is the formation of a regional coalition that will challenge Israel diplomatically, financially, and in a worst-case scenario, through war. So the last time Israel faced a multi-front war was in 1973. So it is not as if Israel is very much experienced with such a threat. This growing sense of regionalism in the Middle East puts Israel roughly in one of two coalition. Now, I like to say that when thinking about regionalism and the balance of power in general in the Middle East, one should think of the chaos theory, where the relationship between two objects is consistent and predictable, but once a third object comes into the equation, the entire relationship between the three becomes chaotic, only with 20 objects more or less in the form of regional superpowers struggling and failing states and violating non-state actors. So in terms of regionalism, two distinct but inclusive coalitions can be identified. The first is headed by Iran and includes Turkey, Qatar, Syria, organizations like Hezbollah, as well as other parties across the region, such as the Houthis in Yemen, as Martina mentioned. This isn't clear-cut as it sounds, with Turkey, for example, invading northern Syria to advance its own interests. On the other hand, the other coalition, we see the Saudi-led coalition, which includes the UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority, obviously also with internal conflicts, such as between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Saudi-led coalition can be identified as promoting stability, while the former coalition can be characterized as challenging the stability, believing that the stable state of affairs the Saudi-led coalition aspires to achieve is on their expense. So the term stability, while it has positive connotation, isn't good for everyone. And that is where the division lies within the regional framework. For example, in the case of Israel, for Israel, stability means having Hamas as a peaceful actor while still maintaining control of the vast majority of lands Hamas wishes to liberate. Hamas obviously objects this sort of stability. Israel therefore finds itself in a constant state of conflict, both from within its own coalition as from without the opposing coalition. So with any development and or miscalculation, potentially putting it in a state of war or at least armed conflict. That said, and this is important, so hopefully we can come back to it later, Israel does not face an existential threat from its enemies. It just doesn't. So hopefully we can discuss this later. On top of Israel's geopolitical threats, like all Middle Eastern countries, Israel faces domestic threats as well. And while each miserable country is miserable in its own way, they all share a common struggle, that which exists between different communities within each country. The communal conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Libya tore these countries apart. Lebanon is on the verge of civil war. Jordan almost experienced a coup, and the list goes on and on. I believe that Israel is not far from going through domestic upheavals as well, not to that extent, but nevertheless, the most alarming threat to its existence, domestic threat to its existence as we know it, lies in the long-term threat, mainly the demographic one, posed by the Israeli Arab and Jewish ultra-Orthodox communities. So while one's first and immediate concern with the Israeli Arabs, it might be their level of commitment and loyalty to the state of Israel, rather than to the national Palestinian movement and the creation of a Palestinian state instead of Israel. This issue cannot be quantified and is often characterized by conflicting events. There is, of course, the danger of a third large intifada, or at the very least a smaller one, that might ignite an armed struggle between Israel and Hamas, as happened in May 2020. But there is also the recent event of the prison break by Palestinian prisoners who are firmly associated with the Palestinian armed struggle and who begged for help from Israeli Arabs, but were refused. So this issue is debatable, especially as long as the Israeli Arabs are a minority within Israeli society. What is less debatable, on the other hand, is the changing demographic within Israel, where the Israeli Arab and Jewish ultra-Orthodox communities are growing at a much faster rate than what we would call, for the sake of this argument, regular Israelis. So it is believed that by 2050, more than 50% of the population in Israel will be a combination of Israeli Arabs and Jewish ultra-Orthodox. Now you may ask, why am I aggregating these two communities together? From an internal security perspective, there is an obvious difference, but what is common to these two communities is that, for the most part, they do not serve in the Israeli security forces, be it the military, the police, the security service, the Mossad, and so on. So you have to ask yourself, by the year 2050, not only that more than 50% of Israeli citizens will largely not believe or support the notion of Israel as a Jewish and secular state, but also who will protect it from its external and internal threats. So even from a very peaceful and civil point of view, no revolution and no war, once the Israeli Arab and Jewish ultra-Orthodox communities become the majority within Israel, they will direct the state resources to their communities and will seek to change the nature of the state. So this growing domestic challenge is much more predictable than any geopolitical challenge in this dynamic environment, and a bit more tricky too. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Omri. That was wonderful. We're certainly going to talk about the issues that you raised later on as well, especially the internal issues, which can be of great importance when it comes to Israel / Palestine as well. I'm now going to pass on the baton to John, because John, everybody's mentioned Iran. So the pressure is on you to take up Iran and tell us a bit more about it.
Well, first things first, I'd like to thank you, Waqar, Martina, Omri, Michaela, Carlotta, and the rest of ITSS Verona for providing this forum where we can talk. Thank you very much. So yes, I'm looking at Iran. First, I'll be looking at Iran in regards to the region. Second, its position in the international community, particularly in regards to the current renegotiation of the JCPOA. And finally, the domestic political factors within Iran itself. So next slide, please. So first, our strategic goals in the Middle East, but as can we go back, please?
Sorry, John, I cannot hear you. Do you want me to go back to the previous
yes,
slide?
Please.
Okay.
Yes, previous slide, please. Yeah, sorry, my internet connection seems to be a bit tenuous. Okay, so overall, Iran has achieved its overall strategic goals in the Middle East, but it has come at a cost. Its intervention in the Yemen conflict, with the backing of the Houthi rebels, has so far prevented Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates from achieving a military victory. It has also been able to maintain its connections to the Mediterranean Sea, for Iraq, with its continued support for the Popular Mobilization Forces, who have significant influence within Iraq, to Syria, where its intervention in the Syrian conflict, as well as the Russians, ensured the continued survival of the Assad regime, as well as the continued influence in Lebanon, with its support of Hezbollah. It has managed to achieve its goals of not being isolated within the region. It has also been able to disrupt shipping in the Saudi and Oman Gulf without receiving heavy reprisals from the US. I'd like to agree with Martina that while the US will get involved when it's particular situations where its direct interests are threatened, like the example of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Iran's continued operations within the Gulf, the Oman Gulf and Saudi Gulf, has shown that it can act without too much reprisals from the US. But these have all come at a huge expense to Iran. For example, with Iran's influence within Syria, recently in August, Iranian officials were having to ask the Syrian government to ensure Iranian construction firms were going to be involved with the reconstruction of Syria. Whilst this has come to pass, recently 2.3 million barrels of oil have been sold from Iran to Syria. Agreements have been made between Syria and Iran to rebuild the Syrian air defenses. The fact that Iran had to ask this is very telling. It did not know it was going to get a financial reward, shall we say, for getting involved and assisting the Assad regime. Also, the current financial situation in Lebanon, as continued support for Hezbollah, will be draining the coffers for Iran. So whilst it has been able to exert its influence within the Middle East, it has been able to make sure it is not isolated. This has come at a great expense economically to the country. which has also not been helped by the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration with his exit from the JCPOA. Next slide, please. Oh, no. So the current situation with the JCPOA has been described as a critical phase by the US envoy. The Iranians are not willing to continue renegotiation until some or all of the restrictions and sanctions have been removed, whilst the US are not willing to remove these sanctions without Iran continue to negotiate. This is also very interesting because a recent report by the Director Grossi of the International Atomic Energy has said that monitoring is no longer intact due to broken cameras at key Iranian nuclear facilities that the Iranians have refused to repair. Now, if there's any hope of the JCPOA being revived, it's going to come with concessions made by the US to Iran, whether it is less intrusive sanctions or allowing more foreign investment, particularly from Russia or Chinese investments, to come into the country. This will have to be on the table if there's any hope for the US to revive this agreement. And next slide, please. And also, the domestic politics of Iran are very interesting. So the recent election of Ibrahim Raisi to the presidency is interesting for the fact that the Guardian Council refused to allow certain candidates to run that could potentially take away votes from Raisi. Also, the turnout was less than 50%, which has shown that the political legitimacy of the current administration is questionable. Also, Khamenei is an interesting figure where he gets directly involved with both the domestic and foreign policy of the country. The saying that success has many fathers and failure is an orphan. So Khamenei makes sure that he is always a father of success and that the president is often the burden of any failures. Also, factionalism cannot be ignored within Iran. Despite the majority of the civil government positions being filled by conservatives, that does not mean factionalism is not a factor in domestic Iranian politics. From the conservative clerics to the Islamic Republican Guard, they will all be vying to have some influence, whether it is continued renegotiation of the JCPOA or a more hardline stance. Also, the fact that many commenters have said that Raisi is the preferred candidate to become the next supreme leader is too early to say, in my opinion. But what is interesting is that current situations with the Afghan refugee problem, with potentially 4 million more Afghans potentially coming into Iran, with already 800,000 being registered and a potential 2 million unregistered in the country, could change the dynamics of the country, as well as the fact 60% of the population are currently under 35 years of old. Iran will have to ensure that they can get these people on board if they want to continue the regime within Iran. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful.
I will stop.
Thank you very much for that.
Can I just step in for a second, Waqar, before you open the question and answer section? So I just wanted to make a point on the fact that these are sometimes very hot topics, and we might touch upon some sensitive issue as well. Of course, we are discussing 3 of the major players in the region, so we just wanted to remind everyone to keep it a healthy and constructive conversation, and just to respect each other's opinion before you, Waqar, go on with the question and answer section. So thank you so much.
I'll try my best not to make this into a duel. We'll all still get along after this, I assure you, even if we disagree. But I appreciate Omri, John, and Martina. Thank you to all 3 of you for your wonderful presentations. And before I see there are a couple of questions in the chat, and I promise I will get to that, Julia and Helen. And of course, I encourage everybody else to send in their questions throughout this discussion as well. But I want to start off with news that has come out about all three countries, firstly, and a lot of that news has to do with more of the domestic issues within all three. So I'm gonna put you on the spot first, Omri, and I'm gonna bring up the issue of the settlement construction, which has been announced. And the reason I bring that up is obviously, as you mentioned already in your presentation, the coalition is already on shaky ground, right? So we have talk about the Arab Party and why it's even there, and how long this can really last and how stable this really all is. Settlement constructions, will that be a danger to stability of governance in Israel, do you think?
Thank you, Waqar. Yes, excellent question. And the answer is direct. Yes. I think that the Israeli government, the current Israeli government, really demonstrates the communal dimension within Israeli society. Never before an Israeli government was built out of so many different parties with opposite political views, opposite socioeconomic views. And pretty much every sect within Israel society has their foot in the government, and issues like you mentioned, building Israeli settlements in the West Bank will definitely shake things up. I'd say that 40-50% of the government is leaning towards the left, the other towards the right, and then had it been 10% towards the left would have been easy, but that's not the situation. Now, the leaders of the political parties in Israel know that if this government crumbles, then Israel rather is going into a very, very messy period, right? So before this government was formed, there were 4 elections. In neither of them, any leader was able to construct a coalition. And I don't think that if this government falls, any leader will be able to construct another coalition for the next several rounds of elections. So if the Israeli construction in the West Bank continues, I think that the political leaders will sort of absorb it and use it as leverage to promote other interests of their own within the government. But this is shaky. As you said, the so many communities and so many sects within Israeli society are represented in this government, for good and bad. Good is obvious. The bad is that it'll be very hard to maintain it.
Yeah, indeed. Speaking about leadership, Martina, there's the news that recently came out about Saad Al Jabri, who was a former Saudi intelligence official, and he's pretty much bashed MBS in every way that you can imagine. It reads something like a spy novel, right? The way he's spoken about MBS and how he had threatened his life as well. His children, I believe, are currently detained as well. Saad Al Jabri's children are detained in Saudi Arabia. He's even spoken about Russian poison possibly being used, to kill King Abdullah at that time. MBS had mentioned that to him. What are your thoughts on that and about stability then within Saudi royals as well?
Well, of course, I think that the case of Saad Al Jabri is just one example of the many that we could mention within the Saudi internal affairs. And in this sense, I would say that this is part of MBS action of repression and consolidation of power that I think that before 2018 was carried with pretty much success. I mean, I think that the royal family, despite some differentiation and internal divisions, were supporting the crown prince. Why am I mentioning 2018? Because we all know that in 2018 there was the homicide, the assassination, the killing of Khashoggi, the journalist, who was not just a journalist. I mean, he had worked for many newspapers, Saudi newspapers, especially during MBS father's reign. So we are talking about this killing because he actually undermined the credibility both from the outside and both from the inside. So from the outside, we see the international community that is actually criticizing, and not only the MBS, who finally accounted for the responsibility of the homicide. And in this sense, I think that the international community, however, has been divided a little bit, because we see many countries, I could mention Canada, that actually implemented a coldness in diplomatic terms, while we see the US, who is a little bit ambiguous, because we see that with the Biden administration, there is, I think, a more pragmatic approach, and I think that Biden is actually asking MBS to be more linear with the international right, and to be more linear with international trends. But in fact, the last Central Intelligence Agency report was seen as a victory for MBS, because the report, report accounts for the responsibility of MBS in the such operation, but I see some vagueness around it. And in this sense, I would claim that the real politics actually had won in this case. And just to add some other details, Khashoggi was a crucial event, because in fact he was in exile in the US, and he started writing for the Washington Post during the elections. And so I think that providing such critiques to Saudi Arabia politics while a democratic president is going to be elected is something that push the US and Saudi Arabia the one against others. So this is pretty much ambiguous situation.
All right. John, the huge concern that's come out of Iran, of course, as we know, is the, or at least claimed cyber attack, right, on the petrol infrastructure, and those cards that are given out, subsidized petrol to certain Iranians that are quote unquote deserve it. What are your thoughts on that? Because I would think that that's a huge concern, right? Security wise, especially because, I mean, this is a nuclear power, whether we believe it's making a bomb or not, it does have nuclear energy, and those are extremely sensitive sites. So, and those have been sabotaged in the past. So that's a huge alarm bell, isn't it?
Yes. Well, of course, Iran has its suspected culprits of the attack. But as you mentioned, cyber attacks in Iran are frequent, and there's a long history of it. What this could potentially impact is Iran's decision whether to move forward in regional negotiations, whether it's with Saudi Arabia or other countries, or the JCPOA, if there's a belief that, you know, cyber attacks will either continue, or whether this probably will not make Iran come to the table. This will only harden their standpoint, and, you know, impact a lot of ordinary Iranians who are unfortunately unable to now purchase gas. So the implications of the attack or supposed attack are yet to be seen, but this is a part of a long history of supposed cyber attacks within Iran. Yeah.
All right, so Omri, I'm going to ask you a question that's been asked by Helen. Helen, thank you for your question. I'm just going to reword it if you allow me. Basically, it's about the Israeli-Arab factor, right? Omri, and I wanted to, in fact, put you on the spot for something you said earlier about the Israeli Arabs and how they acted during the previous bout of violence between Gaza, right, and Israel, or Hamas and Israel, however we want to term it, because the narrative in some parts, in fact, on that was that the Israeli Arabs did, or some Israeli Arabs did, for the first time actually stand with Gaza. And stand, I mean in quotation marks. They morally supported Gaza at that time. What are your thoughts on that? Is the Israeli-Arab approach changing towards Gaza and other Palestinian issues?
Yes, Helen, thank you very much for the question. So the mood is changing within Israeli Arabs, but well, I said the same. I put Israeli Arabs all in the same kind of box, but obviously various types of Israeli Arabs and sects and beliefs. I would say that in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, where there's a very, very big population of Israeli Arabs and Arabs, Palestinians that don't have Israeli citizenship, but they live there. Their affiliation traditionally was with the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has failed them. That's easy to say. And their affiliation now is shifting towards Hamas. And I think that in the last round of violence in May 2020, Hamas capitalized on that sort of dynamic rather than the Israeli Arabs pushing Hamas into the conflict. Hamas just saw the ground was ready. They're getting support from Israeli Arabs. Let's do it. Let's test the water. Obviously, Israel responded. In general, I think that the Israeli Arab population is in a very, very problematic place, because where does your alliance go to? The Israeli state? Probably not, but not. It's not a complete no. Just like I mentioned in my intro about some Israeli Arabs not turning in the Palestinian prisoners that escaped from jail. Is it to the Gaza Strip where Hamas controls it, but they're not affiliated with Hamas, or is it to the West Bank where the Palestinian Authority controls and they might have relatives there? There's no clear-cut answer in this sense, but they're in a very, very problematic situation. And even from anthropological point of view, it is very, very interesting, because the West Bank Palestinians have a very different view on what the reality should be like than the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, who have a very different view of what the reality should be like from the Israeli Arabs that live within Israel. And the people from the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip are, to put it mildly, are upset with Israeli Arabs, that they're sort of cooperating with the Israeli state, that they're just going along until something happens. Like I said, maybe until 2050, when there's a demographic change. But who knows? They've been going along with the Israeli state this far. No one can blame them. But the very, very different views within all Arabs, Israel, in the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank.
But is this also, I agree, but is this also part of a successful, that was the question, divide and rule tactic?
Yeah, sure. So I don't think it was intended to be a divide and rule, but the end result that it is. So we can see what we just did, what I just said is I divided Israeli Arabs affiliations by district, really. So East Jerusalem is this, and West Bank is that, and Northern Israel is much more liberal, both Muslims and Christians, many more Christians in Arab Christians in Northern Israel, and of course people from the Gaza Strip. So maybe it wasn't intended at first, but the divide and rule sort of, rather than just the divide, really influenced the affiliation and the identity of people, where they live, where they were put to an extent.
All right, so I see a couple of people have their hands up. I will allow it this time, but if you, I would prefer if you could send the questions in the text form next time, but I will, because I see both of you put your hands up. I don't want to be disrespectful. Shaheen, I'll let you go first. Shaheen Wadaris, can you hear me? Okay, seems that Shaheen might be stuck. Julia, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for this fantastic presentation and event. This is a question for the three. Oh,
sorry, Julia, go on.
I'll get back to you, Shaheen. I'll get back to you. Yeah.
Yes, this is a question for the three presenters. It is true that this is a very overheated area with multiple actors and different layers. However, there is a lot of narratives running and motivating and pushing escalation, right? Hitting more the hot pot. So I wonder if you would have to, let's say, focus instead of a military or pro-military action in a narrative control. Where do you start? Because there is narratives going inside the area, in the arena itself, but there's also narratives working in sort of a transmission belt dynamic, correct? So what would be the priority to help de-escalate the tension? Because as you said, peace, they're not really in an open war. It's sort of irregular, unconventional conflict. So it will be an unconventional peace then, right? So to get to a situation where we can help de-escalate the volatility of the area, that will help actually not only the area, but all the countries, where would you start?
Martina, I'm going to put that to you because, you know, the question of narratives is actually a really important one. And I will put the same question, in fact, to John later on, because narratives, especially if we're talking about within the region between the Saudis and the Iranians, is always a problem. The Israelis are not left out in that regard either, but especially between those two, because I saw there was a question as well being asked about the Sunni Shia schism as well in the region. And I think that that whole thing comes into play as well into this, because sectarianism is a huge reality, at least between those two countries. So Martina, go ahead with your thoughts on that.
Yes, of course. When I would start actually with the Sunni Shia contrast, that I think that is an historic and traumatic issue that concerns Saudi Arabia and Iran, or better, I would say that it historically concerned the two countries. Now I think that the things have been evolving. So I would say that in 10 years, the Middle East region frame will change many times, but for now I think that a good path a good work has been started, because we see that actually Saudi Arabia, from the point of view of Saudi Arabia, many partnerships are going to arise, and I'm thinking about Qatar and Saudi Arabia, that were not allies, since we know that Qatar has historically been related to Turkey, and that Turkey is not so happy with Saudi Arabia. And in this sense, I would remember the event of January when the Emir of Qatar, Athani, attended the summit of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and that was actually seen as the reconciliation of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And in fact, the Saudi Crown Prince MBS actually received the Emir at Alula airstrip, and he welcomed the guests with a surprising fraternal embrace, and in return Doha pledges to soften the tone towards Saudi Arabia. And I'm speaking actually about the media, because you know that among the big machine that Qatar actually has got, and so I'm mentioning Al Jazeera among all, the tones on Saudi Arabia as well on Israel have been actually very bad, and I could say the same for the UAE, that you know that are good partners, or maybe I would say that MBZ is a mentor for MBS, even if when we talk about UAE, we see two different emirates with two different approaches. So for instance, in the case of Dubai, we have good relationships with Iran, while in the case of Abu Dhabi, I mean, there are some problems with the occupation of the island of Abu Musa and the Tamba Island, but in fact, the UAE, in the overall, they recognize the importance of maintaining good relationships with Iran, because if you think of the strategic position of the UAE and Iran, you know that the security model of UAE is very fragile, and it is they do not want to aggravate the situation. So I think that some kind of work has been started in order to have long-term results, and in this sense, I think that the Sunni-Shia division is starting to be overcome.
Interesting. John, do you agree with that? Because one of the huge things, and I know Martina had mentioned this earlier as well, about the US role within the region, with the US essentially almost walking away, as many would argue, John, we now have these behind the scenes talks between the Saudis and the Iranians happening as well. Is that, as Martina there mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, what she said, a sign that maybe the Sunni Shia schism is collapsing?
Well, I'll answer that question briefly and then try and answer Julia and the narrative question. I do think that the US withdrawal from the well, not withdrawal, but the fact that actors are talking and discussing a potential post-Middle East without an America large presence in it is forcing countries and states to come to agreements and to interact with each other on a much more productive basis. And even the fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran have both acknowledged these talks are going on is a big improvement. Well, previously these things would have been kept in the dark or in back rooms, particularly with after the Nimar al-Nimar execution in Saudi Arabia. A lot of these talks were pushed to the back, but the fact that they're acknowledging one another, they are acknowledging their interaction, is an important bit and factor. The point about narratives and Shia-Islam divide, whilst it can simplify things, we can't discount it. It is important. If actors say they're doing something for a particular reason, we can't just say that's not important. It is a factor. And rather than just simplifying things, it rather complicates matters, in my opinion. It's not just material or other ideologies, it's religion involved as well. And they're all interconnected factors. And it's not one is more important than another. Some are more pressing, but they all are relevant. And in points to Julia's question about narratives, how we can overcome narratives, I think we have to look at points where there has to be shared interaction, whether it is water rights or migration crises. These are points where states will have to interact with each other, and ideology or religion won't be so much of a pressing point. It will still be a point, but these are the things that will push narratives not to the forefront, but to the background, in my opinion.
Interesting. Omri, there's a question for you about the Israeli military. And of course, I want to have your thoughts as well, Omri, about the narrative issue, because that's certainly an important one when it comes to Israeli leaders as well, and their, if we can argue, obsession with Iran as well and the Iranian threat. But beyond that as well, on the military front for Israel, is it because of the neighborhood that Israel finds itself in that it needs to have that strategic advantage over others? And I'm of course paraphrasing Carlota's question here. Is that the reason, and is that a justified reason for Israel to always have that strategic advantage, military advantage?
Well, yeah, so Israel from its very existence had to have a very strong military force. From the 1948 war through the 1967 war that it initiated in a way, and then the 1973 war that it was attacked, had to have a very, very strong military force. And the Israelis always believed that they had to have aerial superiority in the region. So best airplanes, best trained pilots, best air force in the region. Is it a necessity? I believe that at the moment, it's not a necessity as it used to be, but Israel will have to maintain a very, very strong military. It doesn't have to be the strongest military in the region. Strong militaries are not necessarily to win wars. Strong militaries are also to prevent wars. So as long as Israel has a strong military, its enemies would know not to attack it. I think same goes for sort of like nuclear capabilities. It's not as if Iran is going to bomb Israel with a nuclear bomb. It's for everyone to know that Iran has the ability to bomb with a nuclear bomb, and in the meantime, it will do other stuff in the region just to give it leverage. So Israel needs a very strong military, but it doesn't necessarily needs to be as strong in comparison to where it was. But what the Arab Spring did was sort of break up the traditional Arab country, and with that sort of breakup came the end of the conventional threat from conventional armies to Israel. Right, the Egyptians aren't going to start a war with Israel because of the peace agreement. The Syrians aren't going to start a war with Israel. Their army is shattered. The Lebanese army is weaker. Is probably weaker than Hezbollah, according to what Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah chair, said the other day. That he has 100,000 fighters ready to fight. Israel doesn't face a conventional threat at the moment. I don't think that will necessarily last for very long, because who knows what will be in 10, 15 years down the line. Maybe there'll be a big, strong federation of anti-Israeli countries that will have a conventional army and will present a conventional threat to Israel. But at the moment, Israel can sort of relax its security mindset in this sense. Regarding the narrative, in regards also to the Iranian nuclear bomb, I listened to the former head of the Mossad, not recently, Faim Alevi, saying that an Israeli prime minister that says that Israel is under an existential threat because of one bomb does a huge damage to Israeli ability to defend itself, because now its enemies believe one bomb will end the state of Israel. Now, I don't think that is true. Israel is a strong country, has a strong civil society, a central government. Let's say that a bomb does fall in Israel, God forbid, Israel will not cease to exist. So that narrative going out from Israel outward, that Israel is always about to collapse, about to be extinct, that it causes damage, I believe, also to Israeli society. Because what do Israelis think? That tomorrow we might die. So how do we manage our lives in the meantime? So I think it is so deeply rooted within Israeli society, top to bottom, that Israel is always under an existential threat, while it's not. So going outward, I think that's not the best narrative as well to communicate to the world.
All right, Martina, there's a question for you from Zachariah, and Zachariah, the question is quite long, so with your permission, I'm gonna try to summarize it a bit.
Yes.
You read it? Okay, so go ahead.
Yes,
And I wanted to ask you, Martina, because one of the huge things that I was thinking while I was reading this, and of course I want to get your thoughts on this, is also just the fact that will the Abraham Accords in and of themselves, or are they able to resolve the point of view that the Arab street will have and the Arab people will have of Israel, right? I mean, I wonder whether or not the governments become friends with Israel, is it enough to change the people's mindset until the Palestinian question is not resolved?
Of course, and in this sense, I really would like to also make a comment of John's intervention and point of view, because I do agree with him. When we talk about religious division, we shouldn't oversimplify as I did. But let me tell something. I could speak about leaders of these countries. When we talk about leaders of these countries, I think we are overcoming this kind of divisions, and we see it with the Abraham Accord, just because we see that historic enemies such as Saudi Arabia and Israel are actually approaching and closing each other, and I would say at a high cost for the people themselves, because in this case, Saudi Arabia is actually losing any credibility for what concerns the leadership in the Palestinian cause, while actually I think that Iran and the Lebanon and the Lebanese Hezbollah are gaining this kind of leadership. So I think that this, in some way, in 10 years, we will see some consequences of this kind of agreement. So to answer to the question, Zakaria, I would say that maybe this kind of agreements, they can create any kind of cultural interaction. Probably, I don't know, I'm not so sure, but I'm sure that in this case, diplomacy is a great tool in order to bring security in the region. And I think that we all know the importance of security vis-a-vis war. So I think that these are kind of good steps to put forward in these complex regions. But I think that in any way, the situation will be very volatile, as Julia said, and in the next 10 years, we will see many changes. We should always remember that if these countries are talking each other, it's because they are in check. They need they need themselves. So I think that there are some probability we could doubt. We can of course wonder what will happen, but we want to be sure because the situation is very changing.
Yeah. Before going on to John, I just want to mention, the point about anti-Semitism, Zakaria, I agree with you. Obviously, as somebody who has grown up in the Middle East, I know very well about anti-Semitism in this region, and certainly that is unacceptable at any level, be it within textbooks or discussions about the Palestinian issue. But I think that the narrative issue, as Julie had mentioned earlier, just to borrow her words, the narrative issue is extremely important as well. And I think that sometimes it can be easy to sort of default to anti-Semitism when we're talking about criticism of Israel. I know that's very touchy territory because I know a lot of people are quite sensitive about that, but I think it's too easy to just jump the gun every single time, not to say that there is not genuine anti-Semitism in many textbooks in the Arab world. All right, so John, I'm going to ask you this question, which was asked in the group as well by Francesco, and that's about the relationship essentially between Al-Qaeda and Iran, right? And this is interesting because this also then leads me into asking about Afghanistan, because even the relationship between the Iranians and the Taliban has been interesting because, that report that came out that in 2015, Soleimani had actually come to a deal with the Taliban, even though, the Taliban are actually responsible for killing Iranian diplomats in Afghanistan. These make for very strange bedfellows, don't they? Because these are groups which are at their core anti-Shia groups, really, if we're honest. What do you think it is within the calculus of Iran that makes this okay?
Well, first, I just want to iterate, I'm not an expert on Al-Qaeda, so this will be a very loose answer. First, I would say that even if we were to look at Osama bin Laden, his mother was a Shia. So it is not as though all members of Al-Qaeda are necessarily against Shia Muslims. that's first point. To the broader point, I think that Iran has the ability to make allies that share a common goal, whether this is inflicting damage on the US within the Middle East or trying to achieve instability within certain states in the Middle East. That will be their goal. It's not necessarily going to be a long-lasting partnership. I have read reports that there's been a relationship between Iran and Al-Qaeda since the 1990s, but it is roughly, to my knowledge, a case-by-case basis. But as again, I'm not an expert on Al-Qaeda, so.
Right. Shaheen, I see you have your hand up again. I'll let you go this time. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for the very interesting presentation. I have one question for Omri about what you said about having a view of a future in which they can all live in prosperity and peace, and also about the very important matter that you mentioned about the securitization of the Israeli society, of always like somehow living under some form of threat, some form of war, because that exists, and that has brought a great level of depression, of social depression. But there is this thing in game theory, the principle of indivisibility means there are certain goods that they cannot be divided. So for example, for Temple Mount, for the Moriah, what do you want to do? You cannot have someone sacrificing there whilst the other one, sacrificing an animal, I mean, whilst the other one consider that as prohibited to shed blood on that ground. There are some serious problems that are quite crucial. How do you really think that we can go against the principle of indivisibility in order to reduce that securitization and in order to go toward the beautiful picture that you showed us? Thank you.
Thank you, Shaheen. So yes, I do believe in tactical advances towards a better coexistence. You know, what we consider as impossible today is not necessarily what we will consider impossible in 10 to 20 years, and necessarily what people in the past considered as impossible. We know that things, you talked about the Temple Mount and coexistence there, or lack of coexistence there. You know, things that are forbidden today were okay 50 years ago. Maybe they will be okay again in a few years, and just the whole dynamic will change. Now, if you're asking me about solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, no, I don't believe there is a solution. Rather, I think that that peaceful coexistence can be achieved via various elements, be it financial, be it beneficial to both parties, all sorts. It's not going to be a very happy place either way. Even if we do have some sort of solution, there will always be peace spoilers, as they would say. So in the mid-90s, when I think it was the closest ever Israel and the Palestinian authorities they came to concluding some sort of peaceful solution, the peace spoilers, in this case Hamas, they carried out suicide attacks that were beyond imagination. There was also the Jewish attack in Hebron. There will always be peace spoilers. So looking at peace, whatever that means, as the ultimate solution, I don't think that's the right approach. I think that tactical advances towards a more peaceful coexistence, be it in the religious aspect or financial aspect, much more beneficial to all parties.
All right, Martina, I wanted to bring you in and ask you about, you mentioned Yemen earlier, and I think it's important for us to talk about Yemen as well and what that has meant for the Saudis, as well as what in your mind the region, right? Because the argument, if I play devil's advocate for a moment and criticize the Saudis, you know, a lot of people said that, listen, the Saudis, with all their equipment, with all the Western intelligence that they had, were not able to defeat the Houthis, right? So that has sort of humbled the Saudis. Is that your point of view as well?
Yes, I do agree with their vision, actually, because I mean, I think that Houthi demonstrated a very pragmatic and high-skilled approach, because you know that Yemen is about 40 front lines within it, and is made of tribes. So what the Houthi actually reached is negotiations with the many tribes that they that supporting the Houthi advancement all around the country. And that's what is lacking from the Saudi counterpart, because the Saudi counterpart is actually acting through persistent military campaigns, through raids and drones and so on. But I mean, they have stabilized the south of the country, but they are not actually reaching any deal with the Houthi rebels. So actually, the Houthi rebels just take advantage of the strategic positions, and they send drones from the Red Sea line, the Red Sea coast. And they do have success. So I think that such war cannot be won in this way, and such war requires any kind of compromise with the Houthi rebels. That it's hard, because as you knew, there are cultural obstacles and religious obstacles among the Houthi and the Saudis. And I think that this is the case where it is very hard to overcome Shia and Sunni division. And this is very important, because I mean, this is the kind of UN approach the UN is suggesting. When you fight a war, you have to consider the global and the local complexity. And in the case of Yemen, there is a very strong complexity in the local part. So that is why Saudis are not winning such war.
John, I wanted to ask you about Yemen too, because, you know, I was in Iran when the Yemen war originally began, right? So I kept hearing the Iranian point of view that, listen, it's just impossible for us to send weapons to the Houthis anyways because of the blockade. And so our support is essentially moral, more so than actual military. Now, of course, we can argue till there is no tomorrow that there probably was some military support, but at the very least, military know-how was passed on probably somehow. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, do you think that maybe to an extent, the Saudis and others who are involved in Yemen have sort of overplayed the Iran card?
Sorry, my internet connection is a bit unstable. Could you please repeat the question?
Sure. So let me just ask you very quickly then. What do you make of the Iranian role when it comes to Yemen? Do you think that it's military support actually for the Houthis, or do you think it's just moral support for the Houthis?
It's definitely a combination of both. As we've seen with the destabilization of the region post-2003, the Iranians were very good in creating links throughout the region, whether it is supplying arms or actual people on the ground. For example of the attacks, the drone attacks on Saudi Arabian oil production fields and wells were conducted by drones, which would have directly come from Iran. So it's not just a moral aspect, there is actual logistics behind it in the support of the Houthis. Now, perhaps it's a bit more difficult, especially with the current conflict in Marab, where several hundred Houthi rebels have been killed, but there was definitely an element of physical support to the Houthi rebels at one point.
All right. I'm just going to take another 5 minutes of everyone's time. I'm going to give Omri, Martina, and John time for just final comments. Omri, I'll go to you first. I'm going to ask you a big question, but it's an important one, I think. And again, going back to the Palestinian question, and the reason I'm asking this is because I personally feel like the Palestinian question remains at the root cause, right, of instability, even for the Israelis. Is there hope on the horizon? Because I mean, it's not like this Israeli government has said that it really is even looking for a Palestinian state necessarily. I mean, that's been some of the statements that have come out. So is it essentially a far gone conclusion that is not even up for discussion?
No, there is hope. There is hope in the horizon. It just doesn't have to be in sort of like the constellation of that we've had in mind for years now. It doesn't have to be a two-state solution. No, it doesn't have to be a two-state solution. Can it be a federation? Maybe. But there is hope in mind, so in the horizon. Let's make life better, step by step. More dignity, more work, more travel between the areas. Israel just opened the borders for workers from Gaza. The highest number there's ever been of workers from Gaza coming into Israel. That's great. Stuff like that can really make a difference. A two-state solution, I don't see it happening. All the stars will have to be aligned, and and 1 year, 2 years, but for a very, very long time. I just don't see that happening, both in terms of leadership and just stuff on the ground. But I do believe that and hopeful, better quality of life for everyone. So I earlier talked about the Israeli military not having to be as strong as it used to. So funds that were in the past ever to security can now go elsewhere, whether it's education, whether it's welfare, and of course, improving cooperation with the Palestinian Authority. The former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu strengthened Hamas for all the wrong reasons, but now that Hamas is in a very, very good position, talk to Hamas. There are indirect talks between Israel and Hamas. Everyone knows it's there to everyone to see, but maybe also on a civil kind of level, as I mentioned, with allowing workers from the Gaza Strip to enter Israel.
Sure. Martina, I'm going to ask you again a big question. MBS, King Salman is certainly not a young man, so he's, MBS is bound to take over someday soon. Will the Saudi foreign and domestic policy change a lot once he becomes king, do you think?
I do think so. You just have to consider the Abraham agreements. I mean, the reason why Saudi Arabia just worked behind the scene was due to bin Salman, the father, because he's intransigent in this kind of thing. He wants to take up the leadership of the Palestinian case, and he won't give it up. So once the King bin Salman father will die, I think that we'll see a more important approaching among and closing among the two parties, among Israel and among Saudi Arabia. And for the rest, I do think that some kind of consequences there will be, because in fact, sometimes his father actually influences his politics. For instance, in the case of Khashoggi homicide, he decided to close again the most conservative components of the royal family, and thus to make some adjustments within the internal power, the internal balance. And once MBS will have the absolute power, I do think that a more progressist or aggressive politics will occur.
Very well. John, I'm going to give you the final word then on the JCPOA. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, the genuine, realistic possibility of that actually actually still surviving?
I think they're very slim. There's no way that there can be any real reassurance that even if Iran were to go back into the JCPOA, that a future US president won't just withdraw from it anyway. Biden's hope of engaging in the JCPOA as it is now, there's no chance of that happening. There will have to be major concessions to Iran, whether it is increasing investment or purchasing oil from the West, but also from China and from Russia. That will have to be on the table, in my opinion. So I don't see the JCPOA being agreed to in its current state. There's going to be a lot of work need to be done. Yeah. All
right. Wonderful. So I'm going to leave it there for my part of this. I'm going to, of course, thank Omri, Martina, and John for taking their time out. And I think it was a good discussion, and I appreciate everyone sending in their questions. There are a lot of them. I do apologize for rewording some of them. Some of them are a bit long, and I just try to stick in my own words as well. I'm going to hand it back, though, now to Carlota and Michele.
Thank you so much, Waqar. So I just wanted to say a final thank you to everyone that joined the debate. First of all, Martina, John and Omri for introducing your topics, and to you, Waqar, for being here. And as well, thank you for everybody that joined the conversation. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. And I just want to remind you as well, we are going to have another webinar soon in the end of November on Eastern Europe. So we hope to see the same debate there as well. And thank you so much again. Thank you, Michele, as well, for organizing this.
Thank you for putting everything together. Again, a huge thanks to our guest, Waqar. Again, amazing as usual. Team members, Martina, John, Omri, thank you so much for all your hard work. And we know you've been working very hard to keep up also with the news and everything. It was amazing. Thank you. And a final thank you to our audience. Again, like ITSS Verona, the student members from the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom, King's College London, and guests from Canada, from Europe, and the Middle East. Thank you very much. Have a good night or rest of the day. And we hope to see you again very soon as for with our webinar series. Take care.
Thank you very much, everybody.